Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, wherever you're attending from. This is Jennifer Lee, and you are dialed into Automation Hour. This is our 60th session. So if you're new to joining Automation Hour, all lines will be muted. Please post your questions to the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community. We will be reviewing those questions towards the end, and at the end of the session, sometime we will be posting the recording as well as the link to the deck, and that will be available on automationhour.com. We'll also communicate that out on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour, as well as Twitter. And if you haven't signed up for our upcoming sessions, please do. We have 5 more sessions scheduled, and we're looking for more. So if you have a business use case with a cool process automation solution and you'd like to share it with this ecosystem, please direct message us and we will get you on the calendar for this year. And we could not bring this free webinar series without our sponsor, Concrete.io, so thank you so much. And here are your co-hosts, David Linton, myself, and Rakesh Gupta. And with that, we're very pleased to have Steve Baines back on. He presented previously, and I will change presenter to Steve, and he can show you all the flow goodness that he's going to present today.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. And Jen, can you verify that you can see my screen okay before I dive into this?
Yes, I can.
All right, great. So thanks. As Jen said, my name is Steve Baines. I'm the CEO and founder of Salesforce SI and ISV partner called Forcivity. We're based in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a little bit north of Boston. I am the Manchester, New Hampshire developer group leader. I'm also on the Northeast Dreamin' organization committee. So a little plug for Northeast Dreamin', September 16th and 17th this year. I can't announce who our keynote speaker is yet, one of them, but we're very excited about who we have lined up, so stay tuned for that. And I'll give you guys a little sneak peek that early bird tickets are actually on sale. We just haven't officially announced it yet, so you can go to northeastdreamin.com. I'm also a Salesforce certified technical architect, and I've presented in various forums, including Automation Hour. And Jen and Rakesh and David, thank you very much for having me back again. I really enjoyed it last time. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about Flow. I'm sure many of you have heard that the old Flow Builder interface has been given quite a facelift in spring 19, much to the joy of many of us. We don't have to load up Adobe Flash anymore. So I am going to talk about a business case a little bit further in the presentation, but for now I'm just going to do just an overview of what Flow is. For those of you who may not be familiar with it or are just getting started with it, it's just really a basic tutorial on some of the high-level functionality that Flow offers to us. And it's not really a deep dive into specifics. It's really just meant to be an introduction. And then I'll move into a more detailed demo of what we've built based on the use case that one of our clients gave to us. So Salesforce has a lot of power. It's a very robust platform. There's a lot that you can do with it. And Flow is one of those components. And I always have viewed it as the workflow engine on steroids. For those of you who have heard me give a flavor of this presentation before, I started my Salesforce career as a developer, and I'm a recent convert to Flow. I discovered it when I was going through Trailheads, and I had actually saved one of the projects for last because it was on Flow, and I had always kind of dismissed Flow and never really paid much attention to it. And once I went through those couple of projects and exercises, I became a convert, and I love using it. There's so much that we can do with it. I can build things much faster, not having to write test classes and do deployments and things like that. So it's a very, very powerful tool. And you can build a lot of complex things with it. And this little screenshot I just brought up is a little preview into the flow that I'm going to walk through with you that I built for one of our clients. The great thing about this is that you can have it run completely silently in the background, but you can also have a visual aspect to Flow as well. And that solves one of the big challenges that admins and admin developers always have is how do I build an experience where I can gather data from the user and interact with that data without having to engage a developer and build visual force pages or custom objects and things like that. The cool thing about Flow is you don't have to know code. You don't have to know one lick of code. But for those of you who have coding skills and Apex skills, you can still code if you want. One of the great things about Flow is you can actually interact with Apex behind the scenes, provided that the Apex classes are written in a certain way. And I'm not going to get into that today. It's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. So just some basics about flows. And again, this is meant to be very high level, and happy to answer any questions later on that you guys post. So Flow is basically made up of three major components: elements, resources, and connectors. Elements are the actions that you can take with Flow, and I'll have another screen in a minute that will talk about the different types of elements that you can put onto a Flow canvas. Resources are the values that you collect during the flow. The way that I always describe this is a picture moving through the path on this flow, and you have to collect data along the way. The way that Salesforce works and the way that web browsers work is they are what is referred to as a stateless protocol. What that means is that as soon as you take action on something within your browser kind of forgets about you, meaning it doesn't really remember anything. So the way that you get Flow to remember things is to use variables, which are resources. And that's a mechanism that as you traverse through the Flow interview, because that's what that's called, is an interview, if you want to calculate values or remember things about certain records, you store all those things in variables. And I'll talk about variables in more detail shortly. And then connectors are just the path that Flow takes. So for those of you who are used to the old Flow Designer compared to this one, that those concepts really haven't changed. So this is applicable to the Adobe Flash version as well as the new version. Obviously, this looks much different, but the concepts still apply. And overall, the way that you can launch, there's a number of different ways that you can launch Flow, but the two common ones are an auto launch, and you can launch them visually through a quick action or a lightning component. You can do that on a community as well as on an internal page. So it's very flexible as far as how you can use flows. So let's talk about elements and what that means. If you'll notice, the difference between the old Flow Builder and this one is that the list of elements is much shorter. It's also much more clearly defined as to what means what. For those of you who remember fast lookups versus lookups, fast create versus create, I always like, well, what does each one of those mean? Now it's real simple. You have create, update, get records, and delete records. Very simple to remember. You don't have to remember which type of update record one do I put on. Is it update records or fast updates? It's just one thing now. So what can you do with these elements? You can read data from the database. You can create data. So you can create new records, or you can update records. You actually can delete records. Talked about earlier about being able to collect data from a user. So you can add a screen element. You can display information back to the user based on either things that the flow is taking action on or based on input that the user has given to you. You can make decisions about what's going on. So if you see these 4 logic flows, one of them is called a decision. So you can look at your variables as an example and say, if this value is greater than 1, I want you to go do this. If it's less than 1, go do this. Or if the country is the United States, go do this. If you have many records that you're working on, you can loop through them and you can do things with them. And I'm going to show you an example of that in the flow that I built. So you can do some really cool things. And you'll see down below that there's 5 different action elements, one of which is a subflow. So you actually can call flows from other flows. So you can put together some pretty complex business processes without writing one line of code. And as you can see, you can send out email alerts, you can execute actions, you can call Apex from there. Still haven't figured out what the difference between Apex Action Legacy and Apex Action is, just because I haven't had an opportunity to build any of those yet. But just know that if there's just some logic that you just can't build with Flow, that's when you can engage your developer and ask them to build something that can interact with Flow, and then you can just call that Apex directly from Flow. So some more basics. We talked about variables. I'm not going to cover each one of these different types of resources. Rather, I'm not going to cover each type of resource that Flow offers right now, just in the interest of time. But the basic ones I've listed here: variables, constants. Talk about those. So a variable, in essence, is a value that is set while the flow is running, but it also can be changed. So maybe you have a variable that is a number, and the initial value is 1, and you're counting records. So every time you count a record, you add a number to that. That's a variable. Whereas a constant could be something like a record type ID. It's not going to change throughout the flow. So there's a stark difference between the two, and constant means exactly what it says. It's constant. It doesn't change. You can do things like collect records. You can have one record, or you can have multiple records stored in a resource. Again, because of that nature of a stateless experience with your web browser, you need to give Flow a way to remember these things. So you can store a record. You can store individual fields in a record. You can query records from Salesforce and then put them into what's called a collection. So say, for example, you have 5 opportunity line items that you need to do something with. You would store that into a collection. You can create formulas just like you can with a formula field. Syntactically, they function pretty much the same. I don't know if they've enhanced their formula validation. It does let you, the older UI did let you get away with that weren't necessarily syntactically correct. So you want to be mindful of that as well. And two of the cooler types of resources that I really enjoy using is a record choice and a pick list choice, where you can actually, for a record choice, if you have a screen flow where you're presenting options to a user, you can actually query Salesforce for certain types of records and then use those records to populate a pick list. So say you want the user to select a list from a list of price books. And you can also query values from records to populate a pick list. So it gives you the power to do all of that stuff. So let's talk about the things that we need code for. And notice that I've put ED in parentheses because we really don't need code for these things anymore. So you can operate on multiple records. Workflow engine and process builder are very singular record focused. So it's very good at operating on that record that's being created or being edited, but it's very difficult to kind of step outside those boundaries and work on a lot of things at the same time. You can create and update completely unrelated records, and I'm going to show you this in the demo that I do in a little bit. Two similar but very distinct objects that really have no relation to one another. Flow lets you execute logic against those completely unrelated records. As I talked about earlier, is you can execute some pretty complex business processes without writing any code. And I think certainly, your imagination really becomes your limit at that point. I'm asked all the time, can Salesforce do this and can Salesforce do that? And very rarely is that answer no. And I'm finding more and more that I can replace Salesforce. Can Salesforce do this? I change that with, can Flow do this? And I'm finding more and more that answer is yes. So it's really cool and exciting. If you want to do anything complex with children records, you can kind of operate on children records with Process Builder. So if you're updating records, you actually can go at a related list that's hanging off of that object and do things, but it's pretty basic in nature. So you really can't do anything that's complex at all. And it's hard to gather data from users. So that visual interface, screens and fields and things like that. You used to have to go to a developer and ask for a Visualforce page or a Lightning component. Or if you needed to collect data, you're building a custom object with the typical page layouts, and you may not want to store that data as an object. So Flow gives you that ability very easily. And we've all been like this, waiting for developers, say, I'm waiting for you to build my stuff for me. Well, you don't have to do that anymore with Flow. The admins and the admin developers can jump right in and get started right away. So the things that we can't do declaratively, as I said, is you can't operate on children easily or conditionally when actions happen on a parent. You can't update sibling records. So as an example, let's use an opportunity and opportunity products. And say something happens, let's say you have an opportunity that has one line item that represents a product, and the other line item is something that represents a freight charge. And let's say that the freight charge always has to be 10% of the sale price of the product. So how would you do that? How would you actually modify that price automatically on that freight line item if somebody updated the product? You can do that with Flow. So those are what are called sibling records. As I said, collecting information easily, you can't do declaratively. And it's very difficult to roll up data to a parent unless you are using roll-up summaries, which are limited based on what type of object you're using. Or if you have roll-up helper, you can do that. The free version, anyway, I think you can do up to 3. And this is a very frustrating experience where you're trying to do these things and you just run into these limitations all the time. Well, Flow won't drive you crazy like it did Frank Costanza shouting "Serenity now" into the air anymore. You can just dive right in and start building that stuff. All right, so let's talk about the requirements. So we have a client who uses a third-party app called Email to Case Premium. It's an enhanced version of Salesforce's standard email to case functionality. Now, their requirement was anytime a case is created, they needed everybody who was on the account team for that particular account that the case was being created for to be added to the case team. Now, you might say, well, if I define an account team, they automatically are going to have access to the case. You are correct. But the requirement we had is these particular users needed to be added to the case team because Email to Case Premium has functionality that where you can automatically CC anybody who's on the case team. And that's part of their tool. So rather than having the reps have to add people to the case team every time a case was created, they asked for automation to copy the account team over to the case team, because obviously the account team gets built once and you can use it over and over again. And really the driver was that the reps needed awareness of what was happening with their customers, both from a support and a customer service perspective. And as I said, a manual option just was not an option at all. So I had to build a flow to create this case team. So the one thing that you still have to do when you're working with Flow is you still have to think like a developer. Because you are still interacting with Salesforce, and for those of you who aren't developers on the line right now, one of the things that Salesforce forces you to do as a developer is to behave in such a way that you are using Salesforce's resources very efficiently. So what that means is that they only want you reading data from Salesforce as infrequently as possible. And you have to be very efficient when you're writing data back to Salesforce. Otherwise, you'll hit the dreaded governor limits. The same things apply with Flow. So you still have to think like a developer. So I'm very process oriented when I do these types of things. So I think about, where's the data that I need to operate on? And what do I have to do with that data? How am I going to invoke this flow? What else do I need to actually make this happen? Now, what I do know is the end result is I'm creating case team members. So I tend to work backwards from what I need the outcome to be to figure out how I'm actually going to do that. So in this case, I have a couple of URLs here, which you can access later once the presentation is posted, pointing to it's the API documentation for Salesforce's API. I reference this document almost every single day because what it gives me is a complete layout of every standard object in Salesforce. What the fields are, what type of field it is it required, what type of operations can I do on that. It's a great reference to be able to understand what do I need at a minimum to be able to create one of these types of records. And in this case, I've got a screenshot of the field layout for a case team member object. And I've got the arrow pointing to 3 fields in particular. One is referred to as the member ID, second is the parent ID, and the third is the team role ID. Those are the three pieces of data I need to provide to Salesforce in order to create a case team member record. In this case, the member ID is going to be the user. The parent ID is going to be the case to which the case team is going to be associated to. And the team role ID is the role that they will serve on the case. So just like account teams where you'll have a role like account manager or a sales executive, something like that, case teams have the same exact functionality. So those are the three minimum pieces of data that I need in order to create a case team record. So that's the business requirements. So let's jump into the demo. So I've created a flow here, and I'm just going to walk through this. I'm not going to build it live, but I will demonstrate how it works afterwards. So let me just go ahead and open up this flow here. Now I've built this flow to be invoked behind the scenes, so to speak, which means I can call it from a process builder. So just like you would configure any other process builder, one of your actions, and I'll show this to you in a second, is you can actually call a flow from a process builder. So you can see your start element is always dropped onto the canvas first. So now thinking like a developer, I'm like, okay, what do I need? What do I need to be able to create these case team member records? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get data about the case that's being created. And this get records widget gives us the ability to be very specific about the type of records that we're getting. In this case, I'm fetching a case object, and I've told Flow that I only want the case object where the ID equals the case ID that's actually being passed in. Case ID is a great example of a variable. That's something that Flow needs to remember. I'm not going to get into all the rest of the details on this screen, but the one key thing in particular, you can tell Salesforce what fields you want it to pull in, because it's not going to pull in every field. For those of you who know a little bit about SQL and querying databases, in old school world of regular old databases, you can do this thing called select star, which gives you every single field in a particular table. Salesforce doesn't let you do that. So you have to be very specific about what fields you're going to pull in. In this case, the only thing I need off of the case record is the account ID, and I have told Flow to save that value into a variable called account ID. Very intuitive, so it's clear to understand what it means. So now that I have determined what the account ID is related to the case that's being created, now I can go into Salesforce and say, hey, give me all the account team members that are related to that account, because my business requirement is I have to take the account team members and copy them onto the case as case team members. So very similar to the get case element prior to this, I have another get record that's getting account team members. And again, I've set some conditions here. I could tell it to get all of them, or I can have conditions. I'm not sure of a use case where I'd ever get all of anything. So you typically want to be specific here. Otherwise, you certainly could run into limits. And in this case, what I've done is I've said I want all account team members where the account ID is equal to that account ID variable that I just stored the value in. And you can do various things like, do I want them to be sorted, which I don't really care about what order they come in. But this is where the new Flow Builder UI I now have the ability just from this one. So because I am querying a related list to the, I could get no records back, I could get one record back, or I could get more than one record back. So part of thinking like a developer and kind of planning this out is you have to think about, okay, what data do I need to get here? And in this case, because the requirement is every account team member must be account. Now, again, because Salesforce is not going to remember what it found as it moves from step to step, I have to save that data someplace. So I've created a variable called account team members, which allows me to save any of those records that were found into my little briefcase that I can carry around with me. So when I need them, I can open my briefcase up and go fetch them. And then similar to my get record element to get the case record, I can tell it which fields I want. And in this case, I know I need the user ID because that's going to equate to the member ID on the case team member object record that I create. And I also need to know what their case access level is, and I'll show you why I do that in a second. Okay, now the last thing I need to do is, if you think back to that picture of the case team member fields, and I had the 3 red arrows, one of the fields that I needed was a role ID. Now, when you build up case team roles in setup, you can have the names of them be whatever you want. Those are just like regular old records. So behind the scenes, Salesforce is saving those into the case team member role objects, and they each have their own ID. And in this case, I've created a case team role called CC, and it's simply the people that I need to be CC'd on the notification of anything that's happening with the case. So what I've told Salesforce is, I need you to go get me that case team member role where the name of the role is CC. And again, because Salesforce is not going to remember the ID of that role, I have to tell it to save the ID field in a variable called case team role ID. Now, these variables, the key to tell when you're working with a variable is you'll see the curly brackets and an exclamation point. So it's just kind of syntax as far as when you see that, just be aware that when you see that, it's kind of clear what it is. So at this point now, I now have a case team member role at my fingertips. Now you might ask, it's like, well, why don't you just go ahead and create the case team member role and then just figure what the ID is and just hard code it someplace in here. One of the best practices in Flow is never hard code IDs. The biggest reason you want to do that is, say for example, you're building this in a sandbox, which if you follow best practices, you should. Build it in the sandbox, test it, have your business users test it. Well, if you build that case team member role in the sandbox by hand, and then you go to create it in production, they're both going to have different IDs. So if you hard code the ID for your role in the sandbox with the sandbox value, and then you go to deploy that to production, guess what? That's going to break because Salesforce is not going to know what that ID is because it doesn't exist in production. It only exists in the sandbox. So that's why we want to use this technique to actually go and fetch the records from Salesforce to learn about that ID on the fly rather than hard coding it. So at this point now, we have all of the data that we need to do our work. We've fetched everything from Salesforce that we need to fetch. So thinking back now to the requirement of copying an account team to a case team, we have 0, 1, or more than 1 account team records that we need to operate on. We don't know how many yet. So Salesforce gives us this handy little operator element called a loop. What this gives us the ability to do is to run through records over and over and over again until there are no more records to operate on. So in this case, what I've told Salesforce is I want you to loop through those account team members that you found. And it just asks, what direction do you want to do that in? I don't really care about that, so the default is first item to last. So, for some reason, if you have some type of business case where you have to do last to first, you could select that as well. Now, what happens is every time you loop through a record, each one of those account team member records is going to have different values. And you may need to take action based on those values. So again, when you have to reference values from records retrieved in Salesforce or data that was provided by a user, you have to save it in a variable. So every time Salesforce loops through one of these account team member records, I've told it to save those values into an individual account team member variable. Now, what that will allow me to do is once it finishes looping, I can be like, okay, now go do something with that data. So Salesforce is going to loop through that. So pretend now that I've got a couple of records here, and I'll just do this one time. So what I've done here is I drag a connector. So I actually can delete this. And if I put this connector back on, it's going to add the for each item. So for every item it has in that collection, it's going to go to this one first. So what I've done here is I've told Salesforce, like, I just want to check and make sure that this account team member should have access to the case. So just to keep it secure, they had a private sharing model. So as I'm looping through the account team member records, maybe there's somebody in there who, even though they're on the account team, the case access level on the account team entry has been set to private, which behind the scenes means none. So I just want to make sure that that those people should actually be on the case. This was their business requirement. So I put this check in. So that's what's called a decision element. So if looking at how this is constructed, I've said, I just gave it a label of do they have access to cases? And the condition I'm checking is the account team member case access level does not equal none. So in this case, if they do have access to the case, what I'm now doing is I'm creating a case team record. So this is what's referred to as an assignment element. So the best way to think about assignment is you're taking values from one place and you're putting them someplace else. So if you think back to your days of algebra, where you had stuff on the left side of the equal sign and stuff on the right side of the equal sign, that's an assignment. You're setting one value to something else. This is the same concept. So in this case, I'm taking data from all of my previous things that I've done in this flow, and I'm assigning those values into a new case team member record. So if you remember that slide I had earlier with the 3 red arrows on it, these are the 3 fields that I need to create a case team member record. So the member ID equates to the user ID that's on the account team member. The team role ID is that value that I queried because I don't want to hard code that ID. And then the parent ID is the case ID that I'm going to pass in from Process Builder, which I'll show you that in a second. So at this point, what I have now is I have a case team member record ready to go. And you'd be like, great, we're done. But you still have to save it to Salesforce. Now, if you remember earlier, I talked about how you have to be efficient and you have to think about how things are done. You don't want to just say, okay, create that record, now create that record, now create that record. Because if you have more than 100 of these, Salesforce governor limits are going to go off and it's not going to let you do it. So what we do here, and this is best practice, is you want to take that record and you want to save that record into a collection, because eventually we're going to have a bunch of case team member records that we want to create. So what I'm doing is I have a collection variable called case team members, and I'm simply adding that singular case team member to that collection. Now at that point, Salesforce is going to finish looping through the account record, the account team member records, and eventually it's going to finish. So I have one more connector here, and you can see it says after last item. And the last element on my flow is I'm going to create the case team member records. And so this is a create record element. And it's saying, how many records am I creating? Am I creating one or am I creating multiple? And because I selected multiple, it's now saying, okay, what's the collection variable that you want to create? And in this case, it's the case team members. So my flow is built. So now I get to say, okay, well, how do we actually make this work? So I'm going to go to Process Builder. And you can see I've created a process called create case team. It's firing off the case object, and I'm only doing it when a record is created. There are no criteria. I want it to do it for every single case. And my action that I've created is called create case team. All I'm doing is I'm calling a flow. I called my action create case team. This is the flow that I'm calling. And just to show you how this works, I'm going to make a new version of this real quick so I can edit it. And let's just pretend that this action doesn't exist at all. Now I had set up case ID as a variable in my flow. Now we have to somehow tell that particular flow which case to operate on. So I'm going to create a new action. And in this case, I'm going to call a flow. And we'll call it create case team. And here's the flow that I'm going to call. Now, I didn't get into this in my demo, but when you set up variables, you can set them up as what are called input variables. You can also set them up as what's called an output variable. It exposes that variable so you can actually pass that value in from something else. And in this case, I'm passing it in from a process builder. If I set something up as an output variable, that would mean I can pass it along to something else. So maybe I'm calling another flow. So because I know that I have an input variable that I have to provide a value to because I just built it, I can just say, okay, let me add that variable, and you can see that it's smart enough to know that it wants a case ID. So I'm just going to pass in the ID of the case being created. And I will save that, and I'll activate that. All right, so I have a process builder that's ready to go. I'm going to pop over to this particular account right here. And this is just a demo org, so many of you have seen Burlington Textiles Corporate America. This is just demo data that comes in all the demo orgs. And you can see that I do have an account team. I have myself, and I have user 2, user 2. So let's pretend a case is getting created. In this case, I'm just going to make one directly in the UI, but it doesn't matter how it comes in because Flow is still going to be invoked. Process builder will kick in. Doesn't matter if it comes in through the API or web to case or somebody does this, it's still going to execute. I'll leave all these other values empty because they really don't matter. So I'm going to go ahead and just save the case. So just create a case 1033. And you can see that the case team has been automatically added to the case. And that's based on those 2 account team members that are on the account. Now, one other thing I want to show you that demo to you is I talked about there are different ways to invoke flows. This was completely behind the scenes. It was automatic. But let's say that you needed some type of visual aspect, or rather than having this happen every time a case was created, you want to just put the control into the agent's hands. So I'm just going to delete these case team members for a second. And if I click my quick to actions down here, you can see I have something called create case team. So this is just a very, very small example of a visual flow that you can make. So, and I'm going to show you this flow in a second. So if you add a screen element to it, it now becomes available as a quick action. You can put it into a component, whether it's internal or on a community. Really cool stuff that you can do here. So this is very basic. It just says click next to add the case team. So I'm simply just going to do that. It's going to think. It says your case team has been added. And if I click finish, you can see that the case team has been added back. So if I jump back over to setup, and I will go to my flows again, you can see I have a second flow called copy case team from account team QA, and that just means quick action. So you can see that a user is required here in order for it to run. And if I open it up, you can see I have a screen here. So the starting element is a screen. And if I open this up, you see that it simply says click next to add the case team. So there's no user input needed. Now here's something that's really cool. I can call a subflow. So what I did is I dragged that element on and I said, I want you to call this particular subflow. And it also said, it told me that it's like, I know that you need case ID as an input value. So Salesforce prompted me to provide that. So I'm going to show you something, the neat little trick about using visual flows. And you notice in this case, for a value to pass into the case ID, I have a variable called record ID. So a great little trick when you're building visual flows. Now you notice here, this is nothing more than a regular old quick action. So if I jump over to the case object very quickly, and I'm mindful of time here because I want to get to Q&A. I've got 2 more slides after this. If I look at the action list for cases, you can see I have a create case team quick action that points to a flow. Nothing in here says anything about the case ID. So how did that flow know which case to operate on? So a cool little trick here is if you create a resource variable called record ID, and you put that in as part of a visual flow, Salesforce is smart enough to know that the page that you're on, it's going to pass the ID of that record into record ID for you. You don't have to do anything. So it's a cool little trick. All right, so the slide deck just to wrap up here. So just to go over some best practices here. They're called these for a reason. So when it comes to flow, certainly try to adhere to best practices as much as possible. Think like a developer, like I said, you want to plan, plan, plan. think about it, sketch it out, draw it on a whiteboard. Don't just sit down and do. You have to make as few changes to the database as possible. You want to be efficient when you're reading data from Salesforce and when you're putting data back into Salesforce. If you have visual flows, you want to think about what that user experience should be like to prevent users from going backwards. A classic trap that you can fall into with Flow is, say you're collecting data from a user, and as they move from screen to screen, perhaps you're updating some records between screens. Well, what happens if they press the previous button to go back to that screen and then they press next again? You're going to cause that update to happen again, and maybe you're incrementing a value or you're changing a price. You may not want that to happen. So you want to think about that backwards flow as well as your frontwards flow. You want to think about handling errors gracefully. So again, this goes into the mindset of handling errors gracefully. Thinking like a developer. So think about where errors could potentially happen, and what happens if I'm expecting to create a record here and that didn't happen. How do I tell the user that that didn't happen? So you want to think about what should that user experience be, so it's as good an experience for them as possible. Yet you, as the admin developer of that, understands where it's breaking and how you can make those adjustments and changes so that those scenarios don't happen. And we do the same thing when we're building code. It's the same. You're like, oh, there could be an error right there, so I have to build something to handle that. And last but not least, never hard code IDs. I'm a big fan of The Office. There's an episode where Michael is downstairs in the warehouse and Daryl's demonstrating how to use the baler. And he keeps saying, Michael says, like, well, can I use the baler? Well, what if this? And Daryl keeps saying, never, never, never. You can never use the baler. So I just did this and I said, it's never okay to hard code IDs. So when you find that you're about to do that, don't do it, because you eventually will get trapped when you're moving that flow between environments, and it'll end up breaking and be like, what's going on here? It's like, oh, I have the record type ID hard coded, or I have that role ID or that user ID. By the way, that holds true for formulas and validation rules. You want to try to avoid that as much as possible as well. And just a couple quick last things to remember. Deleting variables in Flow can be dangerous. I know that in the old interface, you could simply wipe out a variable and Salesforce wouldn't bark at you. I don't know if that's true in the new one yet. I haven't had a chance to try that out, but you certainly want to be careful about doing that. Percentages are always divided by 100. So if you think about a probability percentage on an opportunity, if you're creating an opportunity record and the probability is 50%, when you create an opportunity, you're actually going to provide a value of 50. But if for some reason you go into a get record element later and pull that value back, it's actually going to come back as 0.5. So just be mindful of that. An unchecked checkbox field is false. It has a value of false. The value of that is not null. So there's a big difference here, and obviously couldn't get into this in the demo, but as you're building variables and you're querying records, if for some reason you're trying to determine if a checkbox field is unchecked, and you have a decision element as an example, the value you're looking for is the value of that field false? As I said earlier, use lookups to find IDs by name. So again, it's similar to not hard coding IDs. Encrypted fields are limited. You can't sort or filter on encrypted fields. You can pull them in, but there's really not much that you can do with it. External objects are not supported. And record ID is your best friend. A lot of cool stuff that you can do with that. And on to Q&A.
All right. So some of us are having issues accessing the Trailblazer community. So for those who are trying to go there to post your questions, you can definitely, within the question section in GoToWebinar, you can post your questions there. So we'll give folks a couple minutes to do that in case you were trying to get to the Trailblazer community, do that. But great tips and best practices, Steve.
Thank you.
I tell that to my team a lot of times too. So
I had some record type ID.
let's see. I have a question here. Hold on. All right. So someone else said thanks for the record ID hint. All right, the statement of encrypted fields can't be used for filtering. Does that include shield encrypted fields?
Yes.
Okay. And Dominic, great presentation today. Any suggestions on how to efficiently loop through related records at multiple levels and bring them back into the same collection? For example, pull all the contact records of multiple account records where those account records have a lookup to the same record of another custom object. The end goal is to pull all the contacts of different account records that share a link to another custom object.
Yeah, that's I followed that. uh, um, yeah, so that certainly is a challenge. So, one thing that Salesforce does let you do is store up a list of IDs before you make a query. And I can try to mock. I've always actually meant to mock this up because you can do this in Apex. So a trick that you can do is if you know what the account IDs are that you need to query on, you can basically save those account IDs and then go fetch all the contacts that are related to those account IDs. But part of it too is it's volume driven, meaning if you know it's only going to be a couple, you can be a little more loose about it and just do a few queries back to back. You just want to be cautious about the fact that if for some reason that flow is going to get invoked many times because you're updating a bunch of records, you can run into governor limits very quickly.
All right. Jim asks, the decision box had one decision branch, which happens, what happens when there are no members?
So a good question. So in this case, so there actually was a default outcome on that decision branch, which basically means if none of the conditions are met, what's the default? I had a single condition decision there. You actually can build multiple conditions. In this particular flow, I didn't have to do anything if no members were found. Uh, so, like, I didn't have to route the user to another screen, or I didn't have to set different values. So I actually did not have an element connected to that default outcome of the decision at all. And that's just a byproduct of this particular flow. But normally you would see that default outcome dragged to some other element that says, hey, nothing just happened because I didn't find anybody that had those conditions.
Okay. So while we wait for anybody else who had questions, one thing I wanted to note was deleting variables in the new flow builder. It does not let you delete them if they're referenced in any flow element. It will tell you where it
Yay,
is, and then you need
good.
to remove it before you could delete it.
Thank you for chiming in on that because I wasn't sure. So the old one it did, and it'd be like, oh my gosh, it's
Right.
gone. But that's good to know. Thank you.
Right. So while we wait, any references of how people can learn more about flow?
Yes, you can follow Jen Lee very closely because she talks about it and blogs about it all the time. Obviously, Trailhead is completely jammed with Trailheads on Flow now. So that certainly would be my first and foremost recommendation. That's how I learned about Flow. I jokingly refer to myself as a recovering developer. I love doing Flow, and I find myself referencing Trailhead quite a bit. And your stuff as well, Jen.
Thanks. Dominic says, Jen said to hard code IDs and not put descriptions on field definitions. What?
I think somebody's being silly.
All right, so while we wait for a couple more minutes, I want to ask you an unrelated automation question. Something different, not related to automation. Talk to us about your CTA experience. Like, what was that like going through that? Because maybe some folks on here are
Oh,
interested
sure.
in potentially becoming a certified architect.
Um, it was it was one of the most difficult things I've done in my professional career was to get through that review board. Um, you know, I admit that I didn't take certifications seriously until about 2 years ago. I had the old Dev 401 certification, and as my consulting business was growing, and I knew I had the years of experiences, I said, you know what, I really got to just buckle down and get the certifications. And they had just released the new architect pyramid with the designer exams, and so I just started to dig in. I failed a couple of them. It was discouraging. I set it down for like 6 months. I was just frustrated with myself. I was embarrassed. I was discouraged. So, but it took a lot of, uh, dedication and consistency to get through it. I will tell you that, it's going in front of the review board and preparing you know, uh, for the review board. Uh, Preparation is everything. Aligning with mentors. I couldn't recommend it more. I mean, going to, workshops, the boot camps, associating with, the groups like Ladies Be Architects and, the architect community. It's amazing when you ask, you just put the ask out there. It's amazing how many people will gravitate toward that and say, I will help, I will help, I will help. I went through the same thing. I had asked a few folks, I'm like, hey, could you kind of help me prepare for this? I had a CTA step up, and Carl Brundage, he's like, yeah, sure, I'll help you. So definitely don't be afraid to ask, because you'd be amazed at how many people will raise their hand and say, I'd be happy to help you out. But it's a tough but a very achievable journey.
Great. Well, congrats.
Thank
All
you.
right. So Bruce asks, even starting with record ID from the UI or process builder, shouldn't you always check after a get records operation if the query came back with results before proceeding? Can't other operations alter the records you're running across while the flow is in progress?
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. Um, it's I didn't have this in this particular flow, but there actually are boxes I could have checked off. So, as an example, if I queried the account team records, I could have said, if I don't find any, set the collection variable to null. I then could have in turn added this decision that said, hey, if the account team members isn't null, then go ahead and do this. Otherwise, do that. So that's a great example of handling errors gracefully. So I could have filled that flow up with. This is not the production flow I showed you, by the way. It's something I just built in my development org. So the production flow actually does have more of that stuff in it. But absolutely, that's a great question. So you want that? That's a good scenario of thinking about, okay, what could possibly happen here? Maybe I don't find any records at all, so I have to handle that somehow rather than just having it blow up.
Mm-hmm. All right, so last call for any other questions. It could be related to Steve's presentation or any general process automation questions.
And related to your question, Jen, if anybody's on the journey to CTA, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd be happy to help you.
All right, Bruce has one more question. Any tips for good methods of fault handling? Post to a chatter group, notify someone, anything else?
So by default, Salesforce is going to send out the fault email to the owner of the flow, as well as there's that Apex errors section in setup where you can add yourself to the mailing list. So fault notification, Salesforce is already very good at that. If you think it's a fault that you can capture within the flow, I always use email, just because especially if it's a fault that's kind of handled, Salesforce won't necessarily treat it as an error per se. So their out of the box fault handling won't kick in. I'm a fan of email though, so I typically email myself. You certainly could write records. I mean, if you had like a
All right, I don't see any other questions posted, so don't want to keep you any longer. So thank you, Steve, again for presenting on Automation Hour, and we will love to have you back in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
All right, and with that, we'll talk to you later, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.